everyone. Welcome to this exciting episode of Arthan's Conversation of Change that we are hosting as part of Arthan's Women at Work initiative. This initiative is Arthan's endeavor to make social purpose organizations more gender inclusive and thereby increase women's participation and leadership in the development workforce, especially at mid-senior levels. The initiative also aims to converge insights and perspectives on gender diversity and inclusion at the workplace and pathways to women leadership. Therefore, today we bring you a Women in Leadership Conversation of Change with someone we deeply admire for the work she has steered in the worlds of philanthropy, climate action, gender, research. Heather Grady, Vice President, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
Yes, I will do a quick introduction for the benefit of our audience of your work profile, and then we can segue to the first question. Heather, you lead the practice area of environment and climate change at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors as the Vice President. You also lead the Shifting Systems initiative that encourages funders to place longer-term, more adaptive resources with grantees who are tackling systemic change challenges from the local to the global level. Your approach to this work has been shaped in part by 2 decades living and working in countries across Asia, Africa, and Middle East, managing development and humanitarian programs focused on a range of themes, including livelihoods, environment, agriculture, health, and education, and gender equality. You were previously a vice president for the foundation initiatives at the Rockefeller Foundation, where you saw an annual grant-making budget averaging $65 million. Prior to that, you served as the managing director of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, a decade-long partnership between Columbia University, the Aspen Institute, and the International Council on Human Rights Policy, founded by former Irish President Mary Robinson. You also served as adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. We really look forward to hearing from you the wealth of insights that you must have amassed in your journey. And yes, with that, welcome again. And I'm going to dive right into my first question to you, Heather. Thank you so much for your time today. Over the years, Heather, you've been an integral part of several organizations in the social impact sector, and that too across diverse geographies, like we said. Calling it an interesting journey would be an understatement. We believe that many women in the Arthan network who wish to traverse and negotiate a similar career trajectory will find it helpful to hear about how you've navigated these different roles across sectors, across contexts, and how do you take on those challenges that come with such kind of leadership positions?
Thank you. Well, I have worked across a lot of contexts and different organizations. I have always worked in the nonprofit sector. And I would say a few just general concepts that I really believe in and that I always tell women. One is to take risks with the positions that you take. I often talk to young women who ask me about career advancement, and they imagine some kind of a linear progress and that you can actually plan very well what you're doing throughout your career. What I have found is very different, that open yourself up to different types of opportunities and don't be afraid to take on challenges. I think it's not been easy sometimes to advance as a woman. One thing that I've found is whatever organization I've been in, I feel like I treat people very well and people return that. So there's a real feeling of mutual accountability and mutual support. At the same time, I would say in every organization I've been in, there has been, sometimes I rub people the wrong way, that I come across to them perhaps as arrogant or overly self-confident. And I think that's actually often because I'm a woman, because I'm simply trying to be assertive, and but I'm somehow conveying instead that that I'm too assertive. that I'm being too bold or too forthright. So I think women have to navigate some of those issues around expectations of different behaviors from women and men. But I would say, you know, taking advantage of a lot of networking opportunities, asking other women and male allies for support. Those are the things that have stood me in good stead. And just always being up for new experiences. I also think earlier in my career, I worked too hard. I worked too many hours. There's a lot of self-sacrifice that women do. And I would say that took me far in some ways, but I would say in today's working world, we have to also watch that and not work too hard.
Thank you for sharing that. And I actually had a question which was very linked to what you brought up, that often women, especially when they rise to senior positions, they often say that we have to act tough and we have to tone down our emotions. Often these are skills that they learn while they are facing these situations or when they're facing these challenges. No one prepares them for this. Some of the highlights from the research that we have collected actually point out to the same thing, that often training programs or coaching programs talk about upskilling women, but these skills, which are very experiential, are not really taught. Women often have to learn them in the course of the journey. And because we are also trying to put together a sort of a capacity building facilitation program for women who aspire to be in leadership positions, do you think maybe incorporating these aspects in those programs, not just the technical skills or the personality development skills, but also these skills which you alluded to about how do you manage your emotions, but also don't really tone down your emotions, because that's what makes you who you are, even as a leader, even as an empathetic leader, right? How can we make training programs or mentorship or coaching programs more wholesome while looking at these aspects, would you think?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, because we can't get away from the fact that we're in societies that judge men and women differently. When I reflect on myself earlier, I used to have friends say to me, I seem so serious at work, and actually at home, I'm quite funny and joking and even silly. And I realized that I had to moderate those, or thought I had to moderate those parts of myself in the workplace. I would say maybe what we need training around is something around navigational skills and understanding in the workplace, depending on which set of colleagues you're with, how you might have to adapt a bit, that sometimes you're with colleagues where you can show more vulnerability, and in other circumstances you may want to show less vulnerability. But I will say one thing that I've learned is, as time has gone on, I've allowed myself to be more emotional at work. Recently, we were having a staff retreat, and two different people said things that made me, it was very poignant stories. It happened to be two men who were each one was talking about his sister and one was talking about his daughter. And I started crying in the middle of the retreat. And it's interesting because people said to me later that seeing me as a senior leader amongst them, seeing me have tears in my eyes, allowed them to have tears in their eyes, because what the people were saying was actually quite moving. And I don't think that anyone perceived it in me as a weakness, but rather as a part of my humanity. I think earlier, probably I would have tried as hard as possible not to show that I was actually crying. But I think if we are willing to take, to be a little more open and to not always follow the norms that are expected of women to be tough as we rise in leadership positions, as we think about showing more vulnerability, it has a really good effect on others. And I think it will be supportive of women who want to show their whole selves, but absolutely for men as well, who are even more than women, not allowed to show their whole selves at work.
Very, very well put, Heather. I think the importance of role models and really showing that it's okay. And if someone in a position of authority shows that it's okay, that this uh, definition of leadership can be beyond the, the conventional definition of what leaders are often seen as, the strong, stoic, unemotional, uh, cold leaders, right? But also essentially balancing it out and saying that we're all human at the end of the day, I think is a very valid point. Um, as a woman who's risen to this position of strength and leadership, could you share how women you think are affected by against similar biases and stereotypes that we talked about, which often hinder their growth in the sector, with respect to, be it men who are not often seen or included as allies, who often end up hindering a woman's trajectory rather than enabling it, or organizational leadership and what probably they could bring in terms of charting pathways for women's growth. What do you feel is in the situation currently? Have things improved over the years? Do you think that the sector now is becoming aware of the biases and the stereotypes that women are facing and are trying to solve for those problems? Or do you think there's a long way to go?
I think both are true. I think things have improved a lot. And they've improved partly just because so many women have persisted and many more women are in leadership positions now than they were. But I also think we have a long way to go. One thing in a lot of countries now, certainly in the United States, but also in other countries, this work now on JEDI, as it's sometimes called, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's asking us to unpack our unconscious biases and asking us to think about, in every culture, there are dominant cultures and then non-dominant cultures. And even in organizations like the social sector, often there are more women than men, but still there's a dominant culture that is encouraging certain kinds of behavior. It might be competition rather than collaboration, or it might be striving to fit in a certain mold or box when that's not really who you are, or it's not what you want to be. I think there's more opportunity now for us to discuss these issues very openly, but there's a long way to go. And I think the main thing with women is, and I feel we face it all the time. If I'm being outspoken and asking something, it is so easy for people to see me as, let's see, what an adjective might be, like very strident or very demanding. Often people will say to me, I'm so direct. I am 100% sure if I were a man saying exactly the same words, people would not have that impression, because the men that I work with and that I interact with in my work in other organizations, when they act that way, but they are not, no one says you're being strident or you're being overly direct. People still expect women to be more gentle and couch their words. So I think the way we have to balance that as women is, on the one hand, if we need to be direct, or if we need to really be forceful about something, at other times, or even in the same conversation, show humanity as well. So balancing, showing that you're not being direct because you're uncaring, or you're not being strident because you are closed to other points of view. But I think, yeah, women, we have to take extra steps and think harder about being understood without those unconscious biases coming in.
A lot of what you shared does talk about behavior change and the whole science of behavior change for oneself as well as the others that we work with or we live with or coexist with, right? And one of our initial conversations were on the Shifting Systems initiative that you were steering, which analyzes systemic challenges facing the people and planet. Now, what can women in leadership positions, as well as philanthropic organizations, do to encourage gender-sensitive institutions and leaders? Could you share from your experience of what you've seen work best?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. A systems lens on problems is really helpful. First of all, it says look at problems from a diversity of perspectives, so that helps. Secondly, it says when you're trying to solve a challenge or a problem, you have to look at and try to change the conditions that are holding that problem in place. And it says you have to look not at singular phenomenon, but look at the structures that are keeping that in place. So it might be something along the level of mindsets or mental models. It can also be around policies and rules. Every system is working for someone. It's working for the people. People hold in place a system because it's working for them. It's not that it's broken, but it might not be working for others. When I think of the organizations we work for, our organizations are also systems. And our systems, our organizational systems are filled with policies. They're explicit policies, and then there are unwritten rules and unwritten norms of behavior or behaviors. So I think about if we want to create workplaces that are gender sensitive and work for women, we have to think about some of those policies and structures that might make it harder for women to succeed and to get ahead compared to men. So I think about things like on-site childcare facilities, about making sure that organizations have adequate parental leave or leave for dependents. You know, we know very well that women really suffer when, I mean, a woman simply going through her stages of life and having children or needing breastfeeding accommodations. All of these things are, they're pretty easy fixes that organizations can do, and they make an enormous difference on the lives of the women who work there. Because women are still so much responsible for reproductive care outside the office, and because we are very just because of who we are. I think also just making sure, for example, that if women are coming into organizations and they're maybe starting with less confidence, maybe starting with less educational status than their male peers, finding structural ways to address that so that men and women in the workplace have equal opportunities to advance. All right, those are all just ways that it's a more systemic approach rather than taking every woman as an individual case-by-case basis.
Got it. And that actually brings me to a project which Rockefeller Foundation and Philanthropy Advisors, I think, has been supporting, which is the Call to Men project, which I think aims to challenge and shift harmful attitudes and behaviors that devalue women, girls, and other marginalized groups, and also shift harmful attitudes and behaviors. In your opinion, how can men become allies in creating these inclusive workplaces and eventually have them attain gender equality and equity in their operations and institutional processes?
Yes, A Call to Men is a great project. It actually now has spun out of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, but we were very proud to host it, and they've been doing great work since the very beginning. I think if we want gender equality in the world, first of all, there are ways that men are discriminated against that women aren't. And I would say the primary one is, of course, that different aspects of masculinity that are valued are actually very difficult, make men's lives much more difficult. But coming back to gender equality in general and equal treatment for women, because the world is still mainly run by men, it's absolutely imperative that we have male allies to achieve gender equality. And I think it's important for women in every workplace and in every context to look for those male allies. Often men are more influenced by men. And so the more we have men who believe in feminism, who believe in equality for women, who also understand we all carry biases and within us, and so who are openly exploring their biases, having those men on our side and encouraging them to take a stand in favor of gender equality is really important. And what I sometimes remind people is that old saying, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So I think men who believe in women's advancement, if they're just standing on the sidelines, then they're not really part of the solution, and they may be holding the problem in place. So I look for male allies wherever I am.
Thank you for sharing that. And that actually makes me want to ask you a question. You spoke very fondly about role models that you've had in your journey very early on in your career. So we speak about male allies, but we also speak about how women, once they reach a position of leadership, what could they do to sort of build pathways for others who follow them? Who would you think has really influenced you when you carved your path, and what have you probably nudged or engineered in the work and the workplaces that you've been a part of, or maybe peers or junior colleagues like you who aspire to be like you?
Probably in every organization where I've worked, I've been influenced a lot by someone. I worked with Oxfam Great Britain for many years, and I had a manager named Susie Smith. Sadly, she's now passed away, but she was a great role model for me and taught me a lot of lessons that I hadn't learned before. And part of it was we had great affection for each other, and she could give me feedback that was a little tough to hear, but it really helped me, and I never forgot her words of wisdom. Later, I worked with Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland. I worked with her for 6 years and learned a tremendous amount from her, but also saw the way that she has spent really her entire life helping other people achieve their human rights, and particularly helping women and helping young women in their leadership roles. It's amazing. I joke sometimes about the saying, I think it originally came from Madeleine Albright, the former an American diplomat, who said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And that's possibly a bit extreme, but I do think if women don't help each other, we won't get ahead collectively. So I think it's really important. And I think a lot of women are right to ask other women to support them and mentor them as they move ahead and as they simply deal with all the challenges that exist for us in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think to your earlier points where, we emulate people we really admire, and we aspire to be them and the work they represent, and probably contribute to building it further, right? I think all of us have had role models, and probably role models have inspired more than books or any other formal piece of documentation ever have. And I think that's also something for us to keep in mind when we're planning a platform of sorts to bring more resources for women who aspire to grow into positions of leadership and power and authority, on what exactly do these women really need, and what could we do to sort of engineer that for them. When we're talking about different stakeholders in this whole narrative, in the private sector, often the whole GEDI or the DEI sort of landscape gets incentivized because there are investors, there's a lot of funding correlation that's associated with a company or a private sector organization being gender equitable or diverse. In the non-profit sector, I am not very aware of whether there is an equivalent of that to incentivize organizations to want to become more GEDI sensitive or equitable as an institution, not the programs that they run, but as an institution, how do they sort of imbibe the policy or the principles or the perspectives of gender equity? Funders probably would be one stakeholder who can in some way incentivize a shift. Do you think in any way we can sort of, when we talk about allies for this movement, what role could funders play in sort of nudging this needle of change forward?
So I have a couple of responses there. First of all, I do know that there are funders. I know the Ford Foundation does this, but others do as well. They ask in their application process, they want to see the gender composition, not only of the staff overall, but also of the C-suite. So the CEO or executive director and the others in the leadership positions, and also of the board. They ask for a breakdown in terms of gender and also in terms of race or ethnicity. And I think when funders do that, even if the funding decision doesn't depend on that, ultimately, it might depend on some other factors as well. It draws attention to the organization to say, oh, we should be doing better here. I've seen organizations that say, we need to have a better gender balance, or often we are completely a white-led organization. We shouldn't be a white-led organization. It's, you know, we need to change. So I think that's positive. But I think maybe in some countries, organizations are still male dominated in the social sector, but in most countries now, the social sector organizations actually have more women than men in them as a rule. So I don't know what funders would do, because I think once the numbers are not unequal, then you'd have to really go and unpack the policies like I talked about before. Like, is there a fair maternity policy and paternity policy? Are there provisions for women who are breastfeeding, or provisions for dependency leave and so on? So funders could do more, I'm sure, but it's going to have to go much beyond numbers and actually toward things like recruitment and promotion policies and other things related to work policies. And I don't think funders are doing that very often right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Heather. I know it's come from the wealth of experience that you have of advising a lot of philanthropists in how to give and give wisely. My final question actually is more to the work that you're currently steering at the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors around climate action. What do you think, I mean, according to you, what is the significance of recognizing the connection between gender equality and climate change? We do often say that often women are most affected or the first affected by any shifts in the climatic conditions. But in your experience and the work that you steer currently, where do you see the connections come out very evidently, and what do you think could be done to sort of make that connection more stronger while designing interventions between gender equality and climate change or climate action?
Yeah, well, I think when we talk about climate change, we have the two sides, right? We have adaptation and resilience, and we have mitigation. And I think for several years now, people have talked about climate justice primarily in terms of the adaptation side of that, and we have plenty of data now, right? That in disasters, women are more affected than men. They're more at risk and more vulnerable. We know that in terms of drought, women's roles are much more difficult because they're often the ones that are, in many cultures, they're women are the ones who collect water. When there's desertification, women are the ones who collect firewood and so on. What we have talked about less is the mitigation side, but I think what we're seeing now is also women have so many solutions, usually nature-based solutions to climate, but also an increasing number of women coming up with all kinds of innovations in terms of mitigating climate change. Traditionally, funding did not go toward gender sensitive solutions, let alone putting money in the hands of women and women's organizations to do this kind of work. There's a couple of organizations that I love that are focusing on this. One is called One Earth, that talks about how solutions that women are doing now toward climate mitigation constitute a quarter and perhaps even a third of what we need globally to really address climate change. And then another related project called Daughters for Earth that is looking at women's climate projects around the world. To me, the more we can draw attention to these kinds of organizations and the groups that they're supporting, the sooner we will really be addressing climate change. But it took the world a long time to realize the intersectionality of so many sectors of work, whether it was health or education or livelihoods. And I think it's equally taken us a long time to figure out the gender dimensions related to climate change and environment. But we're on our way. Now people have realized it's really an important dimension.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing you actually take us through all the various experiences that you've been kind enough to share with us and the insights. I think a lot of what you said resonated with me and probably the others listening to this, as women who are in the sector, women who are navigating different sectors of work, who probably moved between different kind of roles, right? I mean, I started with something, I'm working on something completely different from where I started, but I think what really comes out from this conversation for me is to be very resolute at seeking what you seek, building your potential. There are many others around you who might doubt you, but I think if you are confident that this is the career trajectory that you want to take, fortifying yourself with knowledge, with skills, with networks that can enable you, with mentors, and probably seek out role models who can guide you in your journey are of utmost importance. And I think a lot of those aspects you touched upon today. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor speaking with you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, I've enjoyed it as well, and I hope your listeners do too.